Hello, I'm going to talk some more about Saussure, and I'm talking specifically about, so I talked about him in the last video, and we talked about him in class, and now I'm talking about him again, but I'm talking about what happens further on in the essay we're reading from Monday. We talked a lot about signs, signifieds and signifiers, and how the relationship between them constitutes signification. Okay, we should all be there. He goes on in the essay to talk about value, and he starts talking about it on page 495 in the section on binary oppositions. He talks about value in different ways. I'm going to use different examples than his. I think my examples are a little clearer, and so we'll see. Also, I got to write on my chalkboard again, which is really exciting. I will say that normally I wouldn't put all of this stuff on a chalkboard at once. So some of it you're going to want to ignore, or at least pay attention to what I'm pointing at first, which is all of the purple circles for signs. Okay, the signs for chicken. Okay, the sign for chicken, the signifier is chicken, the sound image, and the signified, the concept is a chicken. That's supposed to be a chicken in a coop. Or if you were at my brother's house, just running around the house. I'm not kidding. Okay, this is also the sign for chicken. The signifier here is the same. It's the same sound image. But the concept is like a leg of chicken that you might eat. So the signifier here, the sound image chicken, has to do more work because it is including both concepts, the animal and the food on your table. Okay, we can contrast this with cow and beef. We have a sound image for cow. And this is a picture of a cow, which frankly is probably the best cow I've ever drawn. And a concept for cow. And a cow is an animal. We then have a sign for beef, the sound image, beef, and the concept, this is meant to be ground beef that you might put on a plate, for beef that you eat. These words, beef and cow, have different values in a way that chicken and chicken don't. They have the same value because they're the same signifier. These have different values, and when I choose one, I am specifically not choosing the other. So, for example, I'm a vegetarian and I like to freak people out every once in a while by saying, "How's your cow?" instead of beef, right? Or instead of steak or something like that. And it throws people because we're used to hearing the word cow to refer only to an actual animal. And I'm using cow here as if it meant the same thing, as if it were doing the same work as chicken. Okay. So Saussure would argue that these two signs have different values. I'm specifically choosing one and not the other. It's the difference between these two that constitutes their value. Okay, so signs work by signification, by going from concept to sound image, signified to signifier, that's signification. And they also work through value, which is this, this, this. And those are differential also. There's a difference between cow and beef. There's not a difference between chicken and chicken. I'm not choosing one word over the other. The example he gives is in French, where we say we have two words for sheep, which is the animal, and mutton, which is what we eat. In French, you would just say mouton. And mouton would refer to the same thing. So that's doing what chicken is doing here, where mutton and sheep would be doing what he's talking about here. Okay, so what you didn't choose here is the differential nature of the sign and its value when we're talking about its value. Okay, let me give you a couple more examples. These we sort of talked about in class, so I don't want to rephrase things that we already discussed. But I do want to point out a couple of quotations and then a couple of things he says about phonemes, which is the thing we talked about in class, and morphemes. So on 497, right before he gets to his symbol of the sign, he says, the concepts are purely differential and defined not by their positive content, but negatively by their relations with the other terms of the system. Their most precise characteristic is in being what the others are not. If language is only differential, what the concept or signified is, or the value of a sign is the difference between it and other signs, what it isn't, what you didn't choose, what sound you didn't make, what letter you didn't write, what concept is not invoked. Okay. In phonemes, which is the sounds and sound concept, we talked about for example, the letters R or the sounds for R and L, which aren't meaningful and thus you can't hear them in certain languages. We talked about in his example of graphemes, he uses the letter T. We talked about C and R and how you might not be able to tell the difference, but it's fine as long as it can't be mistaken for another letter. Okay, these are examples in which things are differential if they need to be in order to communicate meaning. On 498, right after he says the sign considered in its totality, there's a very famous line. There's a couple of famous lines in here, actually. The most famous is the arbitrariness of the sign. Maybe the second is, everything that has been said up until this point boils down to this. In language, there are only differences. It's only the sound that you don't make, or the letter that you don't write, or the signified, the concept that you don't invoke, or the sign that you don't choose that makes whatever you do meaningful. Okay. Whether we take the signified or the signifier, language has neither ideas nor sounds that existed before the linguistic system, but only conceptual and phonic differences that have issued from the system. The idea or phonic substance, that's just the way that it sounds, or the concept, that a sign contains is of less importance than the other signs that surround it, which is to say the signs that you didn't use or choose. Okay. I'm going to stop here for a second, and there's another part here that I want to talk about just really briefly. It's not the most important part, but it does require me to draw a different picture on my chalkboard. So I'm going to pause this while I do that. Okay. I'm going to show you a word, and I want you to think about what it reminds you of or what it means. Okay, so Saussure wants to say that words acquire value based on two different kinds of relations. One is syntagmatic, which is like syntax, so based on what words are also in the sentence, and how it occurs throughout time, so from the first word to the last. And associatively, which means the words that it reminds you of, or the words that are similar to it. Okay, so I'm going to put this in a sentence, and I want you to notice how it means here in this sentence. We sat on the bank of the river. So what probably happens is you think, oh, it means something not what I first thought it meant, which is a place to keep your money. It means the side of a river, a bank. I don't know a synonym for it. And that it acquires this meaning syntagmatically, which is to say that the meaning here derives. This is another way of, we talked a little bit about relying on context, that the meaning is derived because of how it has to work in relation to the words around it. That's the syntagmatic way in which a sign acquires value. The associative way is, let me see if I can do this very quickly. The associative way is, as I said before, all of the words that it reminds you of. So when I think of the word bank, let's say I think of the side of a river, side of the river, but let's think too about what I mean with the first definition that comes to mind. So one would be like money. One would be security. Bank might also, I mean, one might be like the French banque, which I'm going off on tangents here, reminds me of French post office, which is where you bank. Which security reminds me of safe, which also reminds me of bank. Money reminds me of not having any, reminds me of the work, it reminds me of commodity. I'm just going to say stuff, so that's easier to write out, that I might buy. Bank also reminds me of robberies, just because of television. My marker is drying out already. Which reminds me of insecurity. Which reminds me of financial insecurity, finances. Which reminds me of money again. These are different from the examples that he gives because they're less linguistic, but the principle is just the same. If we ignore the part about the river, what we get now is a chart list variety of associative relationships that bank might invoke. You might have totally different associations with the word bank. It means something, it acquires its meaning, the sign bank, syntagmatically and associatively. That's where he gets in the second part of his essay. Okay, this has been really long also. I think we've actually covered Saussure, which is great because the second half of the term relies, I already said this last time, on showing how Saussure's system doesn't quite work. It's important that we understand the way it looks now. Plus, I think it's really cool.